And welcome to the fourth lecture in our series. Tonight we'll be talking about the music during the time which is affiliated most with the Renaissance. This is a pre-recorded lecture. Tonight I'm not quite feeling that well. I'm a bit under the weather. And so for precaution's sake, I'm choosing to stay away from our sound guru, Russ Ronenbaum, who's been helping me. For the purpose of this lesson, I'm actually going to be filming this from my school where I teach. I've found myself a small little room and I've kind of cloistered myself off. There's no one in the building. So let's go ahead and cover this time frame, Beyond Boundaries, Lesson 4. So we're talking about a large period of time, and we're not even going to get that far into the time frame of the early 1700s. We're going to spend most of our time tonight before 1550, from 1430 to 1550. And it's really important to know that when we talk about this time frame, it's referred to frequently as the Renaissance by later historians. Rebirth. And the rebirth of this time frame primarily falls into philosophical and artistic achievement. There is definitely a level of change happening in the music environment. However, most of that is already just a natural evolution from what was happening in previous centuries. Music already had its first renaissance. Its first renaissance was in Notre Dame Polyphony in the Ars Antiqua, and leading up into the Ars Nova. We'll see another major renaissance next week in the Baroque. In this time frame, we're just following the natural arch of what would happen between music that is choral and yet completely based in chant, and what we're going to see in the Baroque, where music explodes and becomes very orchestral and all based on new melodies. So, where to begin with all of this? First off, music starts to become written for both church and secular events by the same composers. These composers are not working in scriptoriums, or they're not being part of monastic settings anymore. They are moving around. They are set composers. This is their career, and they live independent through the use of the patron system. Patronage allows them to be able to be paid by someone in exchange for the music that they write. This means the music that they write will be trendy. It will be music that will usually be very high class because they want a higher stipend for the music that they write. And it will be music that might be just slightly trend setting, but at the same time is also going to stick in line with what would have been popular at the time. Music takes on a decidedly more pleasing sound to the ear, not only to their ear, but to our ear. We see a changing in tuning that allows this to happen. Soaring complexities allow the composers to add more voice parts. So before we saw maybe 3 or 4 different voices happening at one time. Now we're going to see much more, 6, 7, 8, even 12 if we want to go really crazy. Longer lines, that means the music is going to carry on through long moving spaces, and it gives us that beautiful ethereal sound that sometimes we affiliate with the Renaissance. It's built for those huge cathedral spaces, perfect for the day. The celebration of the Mass becomes heavy with musical elements. That means that there are lots of different moving parts that are also musical that now can be extrapolated and decorated as much as they want. This led to many different styles of the Mass for the discerning ear. At the same time, music was forced to respond, as were all aspects of the humanities, to the crisis of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Major questions are going to evolve here tonight, and the biggest one for the musical sector is, should text serve the music, or should the music serve the text? And what is it that we can do to serve God within this oral space? Why does it matter? Well, first off, we're going to think about how music chooses to evolve in a way that responds to the need of the person that is performing it to be able to have a spiritual experience. God before our vision of beauty, God before vanity, God before frills, God's text before music, God's text being musically accessible to all, not just the few and the educated. These are all concepts of the Reformation. They may even sound very puritanical, and these are the concepts that stick around with the Counter-Reformation as well. It's going to change the face of the way we choose to write music, and it's going to change the way that we think about music performance in the church. The Renaissance isn't one specific period in so much as it's kind of this land bridge between concepts. It's between the concepts that we've already talked about of choral music by itself, chant and orchestra and big voices like we're going to hear in the Baroque. But it does put this emphasis back where we need it to be, on spirituality, on glorifying God. That's kind of its goal throughout all of this. And it starts in a very ethereal place and grounds itself eventually in the Reformation. Pushing boundaries. The early period. This is the first part that we're going to be talking about tonight, naturally, by being called the early period. It's the Burgundian school. We're going back to it. And we have the end now of the medieval sound. If you're like me and you're a medievalist, you kind of look at this and go, oh, well, there goes that. No more parallel moving fourths and fifths and unisons and all sorts of crazy sounds. It's moving on to something now that sounds a bit more like what we would expect. Thirds and sixths, if you're a music person. If you're not a music person, what that means primarily is that you're hearing two pitches together that are being played that have certain amount of space between them that we think of today as sounding very sweet. In fact, with thirds, we still use it today. Want a great example of thirds? Listen to Simon and Garfunkel. Actually, there's some good sixths in there too. That kind of really sweet, well-blended sound, that's thirds. Less lavish use of rhythms. Well, the rhythms aren't very easy to understand sometimes when it comes to that late medieval music. And when you have musical spots that are just going ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, it's hard to figure out how everything is working together. They simplified their rhythms by this period. They're starting to bring things down a little bit. They're cooling off their heads. But we're still getting superstar composers. Don't leave that out. In fact, most of the big superstar composers are all affiliated with the same group of people and the same stylistic center of learning. It's really quite interesting. They all kind of stuck together. Rules for composition increased. These are rules that we now refer to as music theory or the science of music. Rules that say when you are playing this note or singing this note, you should approach it by first doing this one or this one. Or if you are finishing a musical phrase like a period, you should do it by going to this pitch or this pitch. These rules that now govern so much of what we do in music started to be created right here. And finally, church modes versus keys. When we say keys or church modes, we're referring to a scale, a set of pitches that goes up and down. We already talked about Guido and his do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, or in his case, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. But we now want to talk about the idea that there were a lot of different scales that were used in this time frame that started to get pushed away. The old medieval sounds that are pushed back, and now we use a different set of sounds. We turned to keys instead. Basically, what we did is we wanted to create the same scale, but we wanted to create it starting on different pitches. And so we did. And that's where we get the idea of keys. We are sticking now primarily with two. We have two different modes of the old modes. We have Ionian and Aeolian that we use today. We call those the major and the minor scales. Now, if you want to hear the rest of them, because there are others, you can listen to them very easily. First off, you could YouTube them, or you could just find a piano. And instead of playing C, middle C first, play a D, and then go up to the next D and come back down. That's Dorian. Go start on an E. Go up and back down. That's Phrygian. Start on an F. Go up and go back down. That's Lydian. G would be Mixolydian. A is Aeolian, that's minor. And then B would be Locrian, which didn't exist back then. And the reason why is it actually just has a tritone, or that pitch we don't really like in it, instead of having a perfect fifth, which all music needs to have. What we must remember from all of this is the rise in secular humanities is kind of the main focus here, and it changes quite a bit about the way we think about music. Suddenly it's about how pretty is this, how beautiful is this, how much does it please the eye, please the ear, please the senses. The rise in experimental use of instruments. Suddenly we start seeing more use of instruments. We were using them before, but never like this. And then finally, an expectation of beauty. We expect that the music is going to be pleasing, even to us today. So now that we've gone through that, let's dig into what it sounded like. These are some pictures. Oh, my middle picture got taken away from me. Oh dear. Well, we'll talk about the ones that we have. Over here we have Benoit. He is one of our composers, and we have Bechois and we have Dufay. Early composers. These are from the Burgundian school, later known as the Franco-Flemish school. The lovely picture from Burgundy where they would have been located as a central location. Now, we need to know is they were people that were not exactly studying under the same roof. They simply were colleagues that were close together that had similar backgrounds and studied in the same basic region. And they liked the same stylistic choices. These are just three, but there are many, many members of the Franco-Flemish school, otherwise known as the Burgundian school. When we take a look at these two down here, Dufay, who we already listened to last week, and Bechois, who we're about to listen to, it's important to note that they both have musical instruments. A hydraulis, or organ, over here by Dufay, and an Irish harp, or portable harp, over here by Bechois, which shows that they had experience with these instruments. They were regular users of these instruments. And that probably means that a lot of the music that they wrote could also be performed on these instruments. They just didn't specify because that wasn't something you did back then. Beyond Trecento and the Ars Subtilia. So Trecento is actually a word that we use when we're talking about Renaissance art. It's the art right before the Renaissance starts to really explode. And Ars Subtilia is the music that we talk about right before the Renaissance starts to take over and the tones start to change a little bit. We start to get the sweeter sound from the Burgundian school that we like. So what's going to happen in this time frame? First off, there's going to be a blending of wealth and church. We're going to see that people who are sacred in their setup, in the sacred setting, like a mass, monks, singers, choirs, are now going to be inserted into less sacred spaces, like court chapels. I'm a king. I want my own chapel in my palace. Hi, you're now going to work for me. I'm going to hire you. You're going to come in. You and all of these lovely singers I'm hiring will sing randomly built, composed masses for me when I ask for it, and I will pay you for it. And then you may also be hired out to do other things elsewhere as well, perhaps. That's a court chapel. We have collegiate chapel choirs. I am sending my son to King's College, and King's College is going to have King's College, Cambridge, the choir that goes with it, and those are for the performances of Mass and other services. These are hired musicians. They are there for the pleasure of that ear, that sound, but also for sacred experience and for keeping in line with a proper Mass setting, even though it's in a collegiate or academic space. The cathedral choirs, people that were hired to be singers at these wonderful, wonderful spaces. It must have been incredible to have been an 8-year-old boy and then brought to a place like this, where they were trained to be an incredible performer, and then brought up to compose music, and then eventually to become somebody who composes. This kind of person did exist, and they made their way up through the system from childhood. It's incredible to think about the music they must have heard and the spaces they must have performed in. The Franco-Flemish school has 5 generations of different composers just kind of dripping their way down through the time frame that we refer to as the Renaissance. And these composers are some of the biggest names in this time frame. Most major composers of this time frame are somehow affiliated with the Franco-Flemish school, and they have that interest in the thirds and the sixths and the simplistic rhythms and unifying and blending that choral sounds that it's really sweet and lush, and they all like following that idea. It's not one precise location, remember. It's just a bunch of composers together in one area. It's not like today where maybe they'd all go to one big music school together. No, no, no. It's just they're all hanging out in the same region. It's not the same teacher mentor thing that we would have today. So let's cross over a little bit into this Renaissance sound with one of these wonderful Franco-Flemish composers so we can see what it sounds like. It's sweeter than what we've heard before. It's more angelic. The text is more audible because it's not blending different kinds of text together. And the rhythms are more audible. They're more simplistic. And there's an obvious attempt for the pitches to be blended. We're finally getting into a point where we really want it to sound pretty. So for us to listen, I have to turn off that lovely lute music in the background. Bye, lute. And let's go back into the presentation. Oh, we got an ad. Oh, dear. What I'd like to talk about really quickly is this amazing picture. Take a look at the faces. I love this painting because it shows us so much about what singing was like back then. Look at their faces. Look how they're squinching their eyes. Look how they're squinching. You can see the curled upness of their nose. Over here, you can see the drop of the jaw here, and the forehead facing forward like this. And look at this set of concentration and the jaw dropped down. I theorize, and I have since I first saw this painting, that what you're seeing there is vocal technique. That these are people who actually really care about exactly what pitches they're singing, and they're trying very hard to get to where they're looking at. Look at the scrunched up nose. If I were singing and I was trying to get to a pitch, I might, if it's not as good as like, I could see myself squinching up my nose like that and trying to put the placement of that sound right here. If you're a choral singer, you definitely know what I'm talking about, trying to get that up in there. And if you look up at this person up here, look at the way they're holding their forehead up. It's almost like they're trying to find the head space that we talk about in choir all the time. Down here, you have a reader that's definitely a reader. Their eyes are going straight down to where the music is. And over here, you have people with the jaw drop that are trying to create that nice, loose jaw motion happening. These are all vocal techniques that we still use today, and we're seeing it in this painting. It's very interesting to me. I think we're getting a little bit probably too emphatic over here and trying to find that exact pitch, but we've all been there if we're a choral singer. We've all experienced that moment where we're like, okay, where is it? I know I can find it. I know I can get it. And I know I can hold it. If I just squinch my face a little bit, I'll get nice pingy sound in there. How fascinating that they're trying to create vocal technique and probably doing a great job at it, just like we would be doing today. How interesting that they cared. It's not just about being sacred. It's not just about the idea of religiosity at this point. It's about presenting something of quality. Benoit is another one that I really love to take a look at. He has written this beautiful piece of music. He's also from the early Burgundian school, the Franco-Flemish school. It's a Magnificat, which is a canticle. It's Mary's canticle. And this lovely setting shows us even another step forward into that feeling of just the music washing over you that we're used to affiliating with the Renaissance. If you've ever sung Renaissance music, you know that feeling. It's just kind of this endless flow, and, Lord help you if you ever get stuck, because you'll never find your way back again, because it just never stops moving. For this next one, I have selected a piece that is more of an indulgent for myself. This particular piece, In Hydraulis, is probably one of my all-time favorites. And as I'm doing a bit of a unique presentation tonight, where we're doing a bit more talking about what's beautiful about this music and less about the massive amounts of detail of music theory that I could throw into this presentation, I thought it would be fun to just share with you one that really stands out to me. It's so haunting. It just has some dissettling chords in it that just make you not be able to forget it. In Hydraulis. This is what we're talking about earlier, of the really a good example of that smoother consistency. We get that really unified blended sound. It's almost like chocolate. It's like thick, dark chocolate. The lines are independent, but they're not contrasting each other. And there's a wider vocal range, because now you see that choirs can have boy sopranos, they can have deep male voices. It's still male gendered. It's not going to move over to mixed yet, but we have this amazing strength of width of how much additional sound a composer can make. Now, the recording you're about to hear is a mixed choir. A lot of times they have become mixed choirs over the years. Just know that that wouldn't have been the way it would have been heard originally. But at the same time, adult women can also produce the sound and can usually produce a bit more of a mature interpretation of the piece. It's one of those pieces that's always stuck with me. It may be because it was in my very first Renaissance musicology class back at the University of Michigan, and I truly loved that class. It might just be that, but this one has always stuck out to me as having a beautiful, haunting sound. Sacred music and liturgical progression. Wow, big bunch of words. What are we talking about? We're talking about what's going to be happening to the elements of the church service itself and to the other elements of the sacred setting. So, first off, let's go over a couple of terms so we know exactly what it is we're talking about. Mass is the church service itself. Office, the divine hours, such as a Vespers, or several of the other offices we have. Matins is another one. The Te Deum, the Magnificat, the Gloria, these are hymns and canticles. These are additional pieces that can be set to music as well. The Choral Mass, this is when we take the elements of the Mass, the primary elements, and we sing them instead. The Kyrie, the Gloria, the Sanctus, sometimes the Benedictus, the Agnus Dei. Sometimes we sing the Credo, sometimes we don't sing the Credo. And it's typically the ordinary, which are the five primary pieces of the Mass. If we want a proper, which is all the extra pieces because it's a feast day or something else special, then we have even more pieces that we can write music for. And finally, the motet. The motet allows us to have this wonderful piece of music that, as long as it's built on a pre-existing chant, it can be inserted anywhere. It's great. It can go anywhere it wants to go within the church service. It's a wonderful piece of music. And actually, it can also be used as a secular piece in its own right as well, as we saw last week in the Ars Nova. Let's talk about the choral mass. So this is a bit of a review from last class period, that the choral mass is developed as high art. It's developed as a chance for people who have a lot of money to be able to hear singers singing out the parts of the mass that normally would have just been done as a chant. One singer on a part was the original way of doing it, and they changed that to being whole choral pieces or whole choirs after a few centuries. Originally, it was the ordinary only. It changes after a few centuries as well. The Kyrie would often still be chanted in England. However, it becomes more popular to be sung as part of the choral setting too. We have some stuff from early on, the 14th century, we have the Tournai Mass, but it's just in pieces. Machaut is the first complete one that we have. Machaut was a composer from the mid-14th century. He wrote a lot of the music that we heard last week in the Ars Nova. Huge Ars Nova composer, both for sacred and secular music, and his Mass is the first complete one we have. What's really interesting, though, is that this thing really develops and goes in crazy weird directions. From the time of the Black Death, which is roughly around the time that Machaut decided to compose his Mass, up until about the early 17th century, we just see a ton of new forms of this thing get created. So let's talk about a couple of those forms. The cyclic tenor Mass, or the cyclic Mass. I'm going to move my head down over here. The cyclic Mass. So the cyclic Mass is a chance for somebody to take one theme, and to stick it into every single one of the different sections of the Mass. And you can kind of hear that a little bit if you listen really carefully to some of the chant settings or the settings that we sing in church today. Sometimes you'll hear the same little ditty that's going throughout the whole thing, and you realize, oh, okay, I've heard that little tune in the Kyrie, and I heard it in the Agnus Dei and the Sanctus. Well, there you go. You've got a cyclic Mass. It's something that's showing up in every single part of it. They had so much fun with this thing. This was the blast of their time frame. You can just tell these people did not have access to the internet, because this clearly made them very happy. They would take tons of different music and put this together. So you could have, this is the Cantus Firmus, or the plain chant Mass. So you're using the same piece. It's a pre-existing chant or a pre-existing melody. And what you're going to do is you're going to stick it in there somewhere into every single one of the different sections of the Mass. And it's hard to hear. Sometimes it's really easy. You're like, oh, I got that. I hear that. Sometimes it's really wedged in there and you're like, wow, how could you even hear that? It would take somebody who really knew what they were listening for to hear it. You can also have a paraphrase mass where you take that original melody, but then you alter it in some weird way, and then you go ahead and you show it. Or you can have that's a paraphrase, I'm sorry. You can also have a parody. The paraphrase is showing it with some alteration. The parody mass is taking little blips and pieces of different things and then putting them together to make this little melody that's going to be inserted into your mass. It's so creative. We're going to take a look at one. The Lo Marme is one of the most famous of these things. The Lo Marme is based on a song that was really popular, a carol that was really popular during the time. And what many composers did, because Dufay is not the only one to do this, they took the Lo Marme song and they stuck it in. And that means at that point that it is a cyclic tenor mass. It's hard to hear, even if you really know what you're listening for. I have sat in on listening exams and music classes with this example and gone, I can't hear it. I've sat in on tests where I'm like, I cannot hear that. I don't know where it is. But if you look at the score, if you look at it, you'll be able to see it. So what's cool about this recording is that it shows us first what that song sounded like before Dufay stuck it in the mass. And then you can hear it once it goes into the mass. But it's hilarious. I mean, I can't think of, it'd be honestly like somebody writing a choral mass version on Baby Shark. And I will bet you $1,000,000 by now somebody's done that on YouTube. I might have to do that, check that out for next class. But it really would be like somebody taking Baby Shark and sticking it into a big classical piece of music. We would laugh at that, but they thought it was really creative. It was a great idea. So let's take a listen. First to the song, which is not sacred. Second to the mass, which is. Oh, and we got to go back one and click. Oh. So that was the song. Now let's see how Dufay put it into the mass. That thing's really catchy, by the way. Take a look at the piece of at this page. It's down there in the tenor line. There it is. Can you hear it? I still can't. I've been listening to this recording for over 10 years. I still can't. He inserted that original piece. He made it much slower and he stuck it into that tenor line. And there it is in there. If you listen to the entire mass, which I would love it if you could take the time to do, but if you listen to the entire mass, you will hear in there, especially in the Gloria, you'll hear like, oh, something's not right. There's something in there that's different. That is the Lomarm showing up. That's the little song, the Lomarm. There's also a couple versions where they decided not to be so subtle about it. There's one where it's going along like this, and suddenly there's a trumpet, just goes do, 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 underneath the whole thing. You're like, well, that's obvious. So they don't always sound as subtle as Dufay's setting of this. But it's quite interesting that he wanted to be this delicate about the way he chose to stick that in there. And look at all these different ways that they had to create masses where they could take music and put it together to make other things. It's really quite fascinating. Let's take a look at some other terms. We have mensuration, which is, in a way, time signatures. Anything that is a 3-to-1 is perfect, and a 2-to-1 is imperfect. So you're looking for a 1-2-3, 1-2-3, 1-2-3 as being cyclical and perfect, and 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 as being imperfect or not complete. These are the earliest forms of time signatures, which we use today when we're reading music. And ficta. Ficta is the raising of pitches so that you get the sound that you're looking for. That's when you get that quintessential Renaissance sound, that da 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 dum, that da dum. That's a ficta. That's when you have a bit of a raised sound on one of your pitches. And you have mensural notation. Take a look at this. It looks so much like our music. It doesn't look like chant anymore. It's not quite there yet. But first off, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. So we're all the way up to 5 lines. And look at that. We have bars. We have measures. We have notes that look like our notes. We have white notes, notes with the white in the middle like we use today. And we have notes that have black in the middle like we use today. We have obviously long and shorts, and look, even dotted notes. They have different reasons. They have different uses. They have different names, brev, semi-brev, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we are definitely making some major steps towards what we would see today. What about the instruments? They're starting to come up. Over here we have a lute, a lovely lute. And lutes are built on several different levels, several different ideas. The lute actually comes originally from the oud. The oud comes to us from the Middle East. And the oud is very similarly shaped to a lute. It has a slightly larger hole, or it will have 3 holes. And the neck is a little bit of a different shape. But the sound is very similar. The lute is a little bit lighter and more delicate. But as you can see, the lute eventually does become partly affiliated with the guitar. A guitar, by the way, at the time does exist as well, but the lute's kind of found its way to float away, and the guitar is the closest we have now. Check out how many strings we had back then. They were in groups. Courses. They were called courses, these little groups of strings together. The recorder. Recorder actually hasn't changed too much. This is the recorder that I use with all of my kiddos today in 3rd grade. And this is the recorder as it was back then. It really hasn't changed. We see a kettle drum. We see timpani here. The styles are the same, and look, even still, you can tune the instrument back then. The hide stretched over the top could be tightened to create the tuning, and you have the exact same situation here. These are sackbuts, and they are very similar to the modern trombone. They perform similarly. And then we have the virginals and clavichords and this whole family of instruments that come to us before the modern day piano. These are plucked instruments, not struck instruments. With the piano, you'd need a hammer striking the strings, and with a virginal or a clavichord or any of the earlier instruments, you would actually have the string here with a plucking happening on it instead, which means that you don't get any volume off of it. It's just one set sound, and that is why piano is actually pianoforte originally, because it's Italian for louds and softs, because the hammer allows you to create that loud and soft sound. And now it's time for political turmoil. This should be a face that for many of us we're somewhat familiar with at this point. We have Martin Luther nailing the 95 Thesis to the door of the church. It's quite a legend experience there, and we have a lot of emotion that still goes into this experience. Now, in this part of the lecture, I want to remind our listeners of something, and that is that this is one area of this lecture series where my different background from the Catholic Church is going to come out a little bit. I was raised in a very fundamentalist evangelical home, and as you can imagine, Luther was not necessarily seen as a person who was a troublemaker. He was seen as a bit of an early an early advocate for clarity in Christianity. We were not Lutherans. We were more in the line of Calvinism, and even with the Anabaptist, if you really want to dig back into the history of the different kinds of Protestantism. However, that being said, I do believe that we do owe a lot to the idea of the Reformation. There was a lot happening then that needed to be addressed. So when we talk about the Reformation, we're talking about the dismantling of the single Catholic or universal church as truly universal in its use of Christian principles. It's not the first time this happened. It was happening for a while. We saw the Lollards in England as far back as the Black Plague that were called the Lollards because they would say the Bible out loud to themselves in English, and it sounded like they were saying lo, 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 because of the way the English sounded back then. So they were called the Lollards. We see some branches of Protestant Christianity sprouting up in medieval Poland. We also see some early scholastic philosophers really kind of starting to tip the scales towards a more Protestant way of thinking, like Peter Abelard. Peter Abelard had some really interesting philosophies that could almost be considered slightly Protestant as well, less emphasis on the church. And then we come across the ones that we know. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and we're going to throw Henry VIII in there, not because he's a philosopher really that we want to think about, but because he did make a major change. And then we see the Council of Trent and the subsequent councils that create the Counter-Reformation as we know it today. So let's really quickly go over these. Number one, when Martin Luther in the mid-1500s nails his 95 Theses to the door, what he's doing is he's first off not actually nailing it to the door to make everybody take a look at it so much as he's simply putting up an announcement as anybody would. And he may have actually mailed it. We don't quite know. But anyway, what we're looking at are 95 complaints that he had that primarily dealt with the use of the way the church was collecting money and things like indulgences. And the Counter-Reformation agreed, to be honest. It said that it had gone too far, that there were some forms of tradition that hadn't necessarily that had kind of run away a little bit with the church at that point. And he had some good ideas. Martin Luther simply took it to an extreme. And there are a lot of Catholics today that actually do agree with a lot of his viewpoints. John Calvin was another one who took it to this viewpoint as well. Now, if we're looking at what is it exactly that they're believing, first off, they believe that you don't need to have any kind of saving through the church. Second, that you are not required to do as many things in order to be a Christian. You don't have to. You basically simply need to believe specifically on the name of God, or to believe that Jesus was the Son of God and that he died for your sins, and then that is what you need to be saved from that point. That the other aspects of it are not necessarily mandatory. For example, a Protestant can still be a Christian even if they have not been baptized. So there is that viewpoint as well that they're bringing in, and Calvin kind of takes that again to an extreme, and you start to see a political extreme that is created in this too. You start to see a peasants' revolt that's coming up along with this line, where peasants are seeing it more as a political move. And Germany really erupts into turmoil over all of this. And the area of Switzerland does as well. And John Calvin really creates some very, very austere forms of Christianity that really strip music completely from the picture. But let's talk about Henry VIII too, because he's pretty important. Why does this all happen with Henry VIII? Henry VIII divorced his wife. That's all he wanted to do. When Henry VIII got to a point where he simply could not create a male heir on his own, he needed to create one through some other means. And the idea of the divorce seemed perfect. It was laid before him as, because of your relationship with a woman who was already married to your older brother before his death, it goes against the text in Leviticus, which tells you not to lie with your older brother's wife, and therefore your marriage is invalid, and therefore it needs to be annulled, and therefore you are free to marry someone else, and then you may have children and hopefully the male heir that you need. To Henry, it made perfect sense, and he did need a male heir. He was only 2 generations away from the War of the Roses. He would have seen, well, they would have called it the Cousins' War, and they would have seen exactly what would have happened if there was any question whatsoever in the dynasty. Henry was terrified of this. He had a really good reason for his behavior. That being said, what we're seeing with Henry is a sense of moving beyond Catholicism in the community for the reason of a political match, a political change. So now that we've taken a look at Henry VIII, we have the Council of Trent. This is when the Catholic Church responds to all of this. We're seeing people turning away from Catholicism all over Europe, and how they're going to respond to this is crucial. And one of the ways that they do address it is in music. So now that we've gone over this lovely chunk of history, which of course we could spend years discussing, let's move on. Henry VIII, I wanted to show you this lovely picture. This is Tintern Abbey in Wales, one of the abbeys that was part of his visitation to the monasteries. Now, Henry VIII was part of the visitations, but the primary offender was his son Edward. Visitations meant that his soldiers came, his soldiers immediately decided they didn't like, and his soldiers tore down everything, Henry's and Edward's. And these beautiful abbeys that had been standing as beacons of light in the community and true signs of Catholic faith were ripped to shreds, and this is what we have left. Tintern Abbey, in my opinion, is one of the prettiest. Let's take a brief pause from all of this drama and take a look over at Spain. Catholicism is doing quite well in Spain, no problem there at all, and Victoria is the primary composer. Victoria's music is lush and it's thick and it's very dense and it's gorgeous music. But there are other composers working as well, like Encina. Encina is focusing more on a Spanish style, and this one is a really beautiful piece, Una Sanziano Porfia, and it talks about both Mary as in the Virgin, and also refers to that wonderful spiritual leader of Spain at that time, Isabella, who helped to cast out the Moors or the Muslims. So this recording, unfortunately, is artistically interpreted. It is not exactly what was put there until you hear the choir in the background. So I can't find a really good version of this on YouTube. We'll stick with this one. It does give a good sound. It's very haunting and very different from what we hear elsewhere in Europe. Oh, and it wanted to go forward. Let's see if I can do it this time. Another composer for us to talk about. We've talked about the Franco-Flemish style. Roman is another style, coming to us from Italy. Orlando de Lassos liked that style, but he also liked French, Franco-Flemish, and everything else in between. He was somebody who had to be writing after the Council of Trent. One of the main things that the Council of Trent decided was that music should be more clear. Music should be more able to be heard by the common person, and the text should be more heard, less twisted and turned in all of this beauty, and more focused on what it is trying to actually say. Orlando de Lasso's piece Surgeon Jesus is a great example of that. It has moments where all of the music comes together, stacked on top of each other, and you can hear it, yet at the same time it still soars up to heights, just like he would have done so in the early part of the 1500s. Finally, let's take a look at William Byrd. William Byrd was a composer who was writing in England after the time of Henry VIII. He was writing in a time when England was Protestant, and yet he was a Catholic. He had to keep that quiet. He was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, and she let him continue to write his music as long as he managed to keep himself very discreet. The English voice is probably the one that changes the most over this time frame because they go very Protestant. Suddenly you hear music that is very audible, music that's stacked right on top of each other. We'll call that homophony for right now. One sound again, homophony, versus the polyphonic, imitative flowiness that we had from before. So let's finish off with William Byrd's before I give you one final piece for the night. Whoop. Remember that he's writing that. I just want to pause real quickly. He's writing that during a time when Catholic masses are completely banned in England. And yet he's also writing music that's very clear. You can hear the words. You don't need to really dig for them. They're not hiding in the music. They're clear. They're there. You know it's a Kyrie eleison or Lord of Mercy, Christ have mercy. This final piece that I want to show you, I did have one more before the end, is the Ave Verum Corpus. This really shows you how much he starts stacking his music on top of each other. Why? So that you can understand all the words. Now music is completely in servitude to the text. It's totally the opposite of the way it sounded at the beginning of the Ars Nova and the Ars Subtilior, and it's definitely different from the beginning of the Renaissance as we know it. Now, if we look back to the chant, it's a lot more like that. It's much more focused on making sure that you can understand the words. But think about Notre Dame polyphony. Think about that V D D D D D D from the 12th century. You couldn't understand a word. This is the opposite. This is what the Council of Trent did. It's tried to show that the Catholic Church is interested in also making sure that the faithful can understand the words. We still see that today, even in our mass settings that we sing today. We can understand our words. It's not all about glam and sounding as pretty as we possibly can. It's about glorifying God. And here is Bird's version of that. So, we've come a long way once again. And tonight, what we discussed is the idea that music is just evolving naturally. Renaissance isn't its own its own genre, sorry. It's not its own genre. Instead, it's a chance for us to see how music has moved from the ideas of choral music at the very beginning of its construction with multiple voices to where it is right at the peak of its own renaissance. Because the next thing that's going to happen is musical instruments are really going to get involved. And we're going to start seeing orchestras. And that's going to really make everything explode. So we've seen the whole arc of it. And in the middle of all this comes the Counter Reformation as a response to the Reformation, which brought up some really good points. That music isn't there just to be beautiful and frivolous, but music is also there in the church setting to worship God and to be used for a specific purpose. And so the Counter Reformation allows the Catholic Church to return to the idea of focusing on the text. Now, before I say goodbye, because I do have 4 more minutes, there was one piece of music that I left out of this presentation. And as I was talking tonight, I realized I left it out. And no Renaissance music presentation could possibly be there without it. It's considered the Mona Lisa of the Renaissance music, and I can't ignore it. It's by a composer named Josquin. So I'm going to X out of this presentation and keep you with me over here while I go into YouTube and pull up a copy of Josquin's Ave. Now, I do happen to know that this particular recording does not do so well in Loom, and that is the platform that I'm using to make this recording. So if you happen to really like this one and you want a better recording of it, please let me know and I can send you the link. In my opinion, this is probably the most beautiful piece of music ever written, and it's absolutely crucial that we get a chance to hear it as part of this. This is the pinnacle of the Renaissance. This is what we lost when we decided to focus on sacred music as a more integral part, more a part that has more integrity to it versus what we were looking at before, which is a sense of beauty. We've lost a little bit of this, but that doesn't mean that we still can't go back and enjoy it. I hope you've had a chance to enjoy this music. More than anything else, this is a time of true beauty. It's not necessarily a time of true sacred contemplation, which we will find later, especially when we get into the 19th and 20th centuries. And it's not something we saw in early medieval music, but it is a chance for music to really become something artistic and to really fly into the air in a way that we've never heard before. It's like hearing a painting, and I don't think we're ever really going to find it to that extent again, with lines that just soar like that. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's lecture. Have a wonderful evening. I'll see you next week. Hopefully, virtually, I'll be a little bit more live than I am right now. And we will be looking at the Baroque and music's second Renaissance. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.
If you want to see any of the other lessons that we have, click up here and you will get a chance to see the other lessons in this series. Have fun. Bye.